Charleston just experienced 3 earthquakes in the last week, and I'm watching buyers obsess over completely the wrong question. They're Googling the earthquake of 1886, researching fault lines, asking me about building codes. Meanwhile, nobody's talking about the $50,000 deductible that makes earthquake insurance just downright unaffordable. Here's the earthquake conversation your agent won't touch. All right, let's start with the earthquake of 1886. Let's just begin with a little bit of history. On August 31, 1886, Charleston gets hit with a 7.3 magnitude earthquake, the largest in the southeastern history. Over 60 people died. Thousands of buildings were destroyed. The city was literally leveled in some areas. Now, after 20 years of helping people move to Charleston and studying this market inside and out, here's what you really need to understand about that event. Every single building that failed back then was unreinforced brick or masonry. There were 0 earthquake codes, 0 structural standards. They were basically stacking brick and mortar with no steel, no anchoring, no reinforcement at all. Of course, those buildings came down. Since 1886, Charleston has experienced thousands of smaller earthquakes. Most of them you never even feel. The recent earthquakes in Somerville this week were between 1.6 and 2.9. That sounds scary if you don't know what it means. But here's what really matters about magnitude of earthquakes. Structural damage usually doesn't start happening until you get to about a 5.0 or higher. A 2.0 to 3.4 is typically barely noticeable unless you're sitting in a quiet room. Now, could another major earthquake happen in Charleston? Absolutely. The fault lines are still here. The seismic zone is still active. I wouldn't be doing my job if I pretended otherwise. I can tell you the risk conversation today is completely different from what it was in 1886. And that's because today's homes are built under modern building codes. They have reinforced foundations. They're tied into slabs. There are structural requirements that didn't even exist back in the 1800s. And that really matters. It's a massive difference in how energy moves through a structure. And stay with me, because when we talk about the full insurance picture, especially the budget conversation, things change pretty quickly. Most buyers focus on the wrong risk first. But before we get to that, here's the key takeaway. The impact of a major earthquake in Charleston today would be drastically different than it was in 1886. It's just different construction, different codes, different engineering, and understanding that changes how you should think about earthquake risk when you're buying in the Charleston area. Now let's talk about modern building codes. Here's what's changed since 1886, and this is critical if you're buying a home in Charleston, South Carolina. South Carolina has had a seismic building code system in place since the 1970s. That means every home built in the last 50 years has reinforced foundations, proper anchoring systems, and structural designs that allow the home to flex during seismic activity instead of just crumbling. The homes built under the modern codes are designed for movement. They're designed to absorb energy. That's a massive shift from how homes were built in 1886. Let's talk about what that actually means for you. Modern homes have a rebar reinforced concrete foundation. They have anchor bolts tying that foundation to the frame. They have shear walls and proper bracing systems. These aren't just random upgrades. These are specific engineering requirements because Charleston sits on an active seismic zone. Now, what about the older homes? The most vulnerable properties are historic downtown homes, especially those built before 1970. Many of those are still primarily unreinforced masonry, brick and mortar without internal steel. And if you're buying one of those, you absolutely need to understand what you're stepping into. But here's what most people don't know. Over the past 140 years, many of those homes have been retrofitted for earthquakes. After smaller earthquakes and even for hurricanes during major renovations, they've added steel rods, the foundations have been improved, and structural reinforcements have been installed. Look, have you ever been downtown and seen those big circle black plates on the side of brick buildings, right on the front of a building? Those are earthquake piers that were installed after the earthquake of 1886. What they did is they took long steel cables and they connected one end to that one black pier, and on the other side there's an identical black circle, and then they would crank that the crank, there's a little square in the middle, and that would true up the buildings and also reinforce them for earthquakes. That was the first earthquake preventative measures that happened historically in downtown Charleston. I've worked personally with buyers on historic properties where we ordered seismic assessments before closing. You're gonna need that data, especially with 3 earthquakes happening in Charleston last week. Here's what really matters. The construction year changes your entire risk profile. A home built after 1980 is completely different structurally than the ones that were built before 1980. That difference shows up in inspections, and it should show up in underwriting with your loan. And it absolutely shows up in insurance deductibles. So could another 7.3 magnitude earthquake happen in Charleston? Yes, the seismic zone is active. But would it cause the same level of devastation we saw in 1886? Probably not. Those modern construction standards have dramatically reduced the risk of catastrophic structural failure. That doesn't mean zero risk. It just means the risk profile today is fundamentally different than it was 140 years ago. And that difference directly impacts whether earthquake insurance makes sense for your specific property or not. That's exactly what we need to look at next. Now, if you're seriously considering Charleston and trying to figure out whether earthquake risk should change where you buy and what you buy, I do this every single day. I help people every day find the right home in Charleston and have the right coverage. So just shoot me an email, matto@mattonealteam.com, or send me a text, 843-619-0401. All my contact information is in the description below, and I'd love to help you. Now we're going to talk about insurance. So earthquake coverage is not included in your standard homeowner's policy. You have to buy a separate rider or endorsement on top of your standalone insurance policy. A lot of buyers don't realize that they don't have earthquake protection when they get an insurance policy. In Charleston, you're often looking at a few $100s a year for earthquake insurance. That's it. Your range depends on your home value, the age of the home, and where it's located. A pre-1900 historic property downtown will usually cost more than a 2015 built home in Nexton. The construction absolutely matters. Let's talk about what you're getting for that premium. Earthquake insurance covers structural damage to your home. It also covers detached structures like garages and sheds. And you get personal property coverage for your belongings inside the home. On the surface, that sounds really solid. But here's what matters, and this is where most buyers get surprised. Earthquake insurance typically comes with a 10 to 20% deductible based on your insured value. It's not a flat $1,000 or $5,000. It's a percentage. So what does that mean in real numbers? If you're talking about a $500,000 home, your deductible is going to be $50,000 to $75,000. That means you're paying the first $50,000 to $75,000 out of pocket before your insurance would pay a dime. If you have $40,000 in damage, you get $0 from your policy. The coverage only activates after you cross the threshold of your deductible. And that's a pretty massive deductible. Now, here's my recommendation. After helping over 5,000 families buy homes in Charleston and selling $3 billion in Charleston residential real estate. If you're buying a historic home built before 1900, especially unreinforced masonry downtown, you absolutely need to get earthquake insurance. The structural risk is legitimately higher, and the repair cost can be catastrophic. If you're buying a home built after 1980 with modern seismic standards, it becomes a personal risk tolerance decision. When we get to the action steps in a minute, I'm going to show you exactly how to budget for all this together, but I'm getting ahead of myself here. So you're paying about $400 to $800 per year for coverage, and it only kicks in with catastrophic damage. Some buyers absolutely want that peace of mind. Others look at the deductible and decide the math doesn't really make sense for them. I've had clients go in both directions, and I do not push one way or the other. My job is to make sure you understand the numbers, you understand the risk, you understand the deductible structure, how that specifically factors into your personal risk profile. Then you make an informed decision. So that's the earthquake insurance breakdown. Now let's put this in perspective with flood insurance, wind and hail, and everything else you need to budget for when you're buying a home in Charleston. Because when you see the full insurance picture, that's where it gets really interesting. All right, we're gonna take a bigger picture look at a risk comparison. We're gonna rank all of Charleston's actual concerns in the order they should really be thought about. Number 1, flooding, tidal flooding, storm surge, heavy rain events. This is more frequent than earthquakes. We're talking about regular occurrences, not once in a lifetime events. Flood insurance is mandatory in many areas that are in a flood zone. You have to look at your flood zone mapping first and make sure that your home that you're buying is indeed in a flood zone. But even if it's not, that's considered an X zone, I still highly recommend flood insurance. Anyone who buys a property in the greater Charleston area should get flood insurance. And if you're in an X zone, it's going to be pretty affordable, like only $500 a year. That is a real risk for anybody in Charleston. And when the hurricane surge comes, sometimes they count that damage as flood damage and not hurricane damage. So this impacts you very often and is the first thing you have to consider. Number 2 insurance. So the number 2 thing you have to consider is hurricanes. We're on the coast. Hurricane season runs in Charleston from June 1 through November 30th every year. Wind damage, storm surge exposure, and possible evacuations are part of living in Charleston. It's just part of coastal living here. When you compare that to a 140-year gap since the last major earthquake, the frequency of hurricanes definitely is going to get your attention faster. Number 3, the third thing you need to think about is rising insurance costs. Flood premiums have increased. Wind and hail coverage has gone up as well. We're seeing standard homeowners policies climbing every single year. And when you stack all of that together, your total monthly housing cost does shift. That's a real concern for buyers right now. All right, the number 4 thing you have to think about is earthquakes. Yeah, they're on the list because we are in a seismic zone. Somerville is sitting on a fault line. They're just not the top concern compared to flooding, hurricanes, and possibly rising insurance costs. So after selling all this real estate, I can tell you that most transactions are impacted far more by flood zones and wind and hail underwriting and by earthquake insurance. But here's what I tell every buyer I work with. Put the risk in perspective. Charleston is seismically active. We did have 3 small earthquakes in the last week. These small earthquakes do happen regularly, and a major one could happen. Just when you compare the probability of an earthquake to flooding or hurricanes, you're probably going to see flooding and hurricanes happen more frequently. That doesn't mean you should just ignore earthquake insurance. It just means understanding your risk. So factor all of that into your budget and then make a best decision that you can. But don't let earthquake fear override the other environmental and financial factors that will definitely impact daily life and your long-term investment in Charleston more often. Now let's talk about exactly what you need to do with all this information when you're actually buying a home in Charleston, because this is where it really matters. Now here's exactly what to do with all the information when you're buying a home in Charleston. First, the budget is typically in the few hundreds of dollars a year as a potential line item. Even if you decide not to buy earthquake insurance, you need to know that the cost does exist and you can opt in for it. When you're running your numbers, add up the flood insurance, the wind and hail insurance, and standard homeowners insurance. And then if you want, layer on an extra protection for earthquake insurance. Second, if you're looking at older historic homes, get a seismic assessment. I'm talking about homes built before 1900, especially unreinforced masonry downtown Charleston. You're going to want a structural engineer to evaluate that property. What retrofitting has been done structurally? Are there steel rods installed? Has the foundation been improved? That report will help you decide whether earthquake insurance is going to make sense for that specific property. Third, ask about construction details when you're touring homes. When was it built? What type of foundation does it have? Is it reinforced concrete slab, pier and beam? After selling a lot of real estate in Charleston, I can tell you that construction and foundation types do change your risk profile for each property. Fourth, understand that your home inspection should be evaluating structural elements regardless of earthquake concerns. You have to look at the foundation integrity. You have to look at proper anchoring. You have to look at structural soundness. These mattered for overall stability, not just seismic resistance. A good home inspection does protect you in these scenarios. And here's my bottom line. Earthquake risk in Charleston is real, but it's lower risk compared to other coastal hazards you're gonna have to deal with when you move here. And I've seen far more homes damaged by flooding and hurricanes than I've ever seen damaged by earthquakes in my lifetime. And that frequency does matter. And this is where it gets really important. Flood insurance in higher risk zones can run you between $2,000 and all the way up to $10,000 or more per year. Wind and hail premiums have increased significantly, like maybe up to $1,000 for some houses. And standard homeowners insurance has climbed as well. When you add all of these insurances up, earthquake coverage on top can seem like a pretty big cost. You could be reaching over $10,000 a year for insurance. That's $500 to $800 per month for earthquake insurance that you may decide not to get. Plus you have your property taxes and your HOA dues if you live in an HOA area. Good news on property taxes is most people are pleasantly surprised at how low primary homeowners taxes are in Charleston, especially if you're from the Northeast. People in New Jersey or New York, they look at our taxes and they say this is 1/3 of what we've been paying for a house very similar. But all these costs do impact what price point is going to make sense for you when you move here. Most buyers obsess over the wrong hazards. They focus on the 1886 earthquake and they ignore the flood zone map. They debate earthquake insurance and they don't run the full monthly numbers. If you want to talk through risk, like real risk profiles from earthquakes to floods to hurricanes, and talk about which Charleston neighborhoods are going to give you the best balance of value in manageable insurance costs, just send me an email, matto@mattonealteam.com, or you can text me at 843-619-0401. I've also linked my video breaking down the 10 major projects reshaping Charleston right now, including Google's $9 billion investment in Charleston. These projects are stacking on top of each other and completely changing our town. Now, thanks for watching, and I'm going to see you on the next video.